Inside every warship, beneath the guns and behind the machinery, there was something far more complex than steel or firepower. There was culture, shaped over decades and sometimes centuries. A sailor did not simply belong to a vessel. He belonged to a way of thinking, formed by routine, expectation, and the traditions of his navy. When war came, fleets carried identities, each one reflecting the nation behind it. In this story, we will look at the major navies and how the cultures within shaped the men who served, fought, and endured at sea. The Royal Navy. Life aboard a British warship followed a rhythm that rarely varied. The day was structured, predictable, and carefully ordered, not because war demanded rigidity, but because routine provided stability in an environment that was otherwise uncertain and often dangerous. Sailors cleaned, maintained, drilled, and stood watch according to a system that had been proven over generations. Yet what truly defined the Royal Navy was not just its structure, but its humanity. The relationship between officers and enlisted men remained hierarchical, but it was not entirely distant. There was room for personality, humor, and even quiet resistance in the form of constant complaint. British sailors were known for grumbling about almost everything, from food to weather to leadership, but this did not undermine discipline. Instead, it became part of the culture itself, a way of releasing pressure without breaking cohesion. Nothing represented this balance more clearly than the daily rum ration. At a set time each day, the call for up spirits would echo across the ship, and sailors would gather to receive their carefully measured tot of rum, often diluted into grog. This was more than a drink. It was a ritual that connected modern sailors to centuries of naval tradition, a small moment of normality in the middle of war that reinforced identity and morale without weakening discipline. In port, British sailors carried this same mixture of professionalism and informality. They were known for drinking, joking, and occasionally getting into trouble, but rarely in a way that made them feared. Instead, they were seen as approachable, experienced, and steady, representing a navy that was deeply seasoned. The United States Navy. Where the Royal Navy had been shaped by history, the United States Navy was shaped by rapid expansion and industrial power. It was a force that grew quickly during the war, transforming into the largest navy in the world, and its culture reflected this momentum. American sailors operated within a system that emphasized efficiency, organization, and practical solutions. Compared to their British counterparts, they were often better fed, better paid, and provided with more consistent living conditions, as the Navy drew on the immense industrial capacity of the United States to support its fleet. Discipline remained important, but it was enforced through regulation and procedure rather than tradition. Where British sailors relied on inherited customs, American sailors relied on clearly defined systems that dictated how tasks were performed and how problems were solved. One of the clearest differences was the absence of a daily alcohol ration. The U.S. Navy largely prohibited alcohol aboard its ships, creating an environment that was more controlled and predictable. This did not eliminate stress or tension, but it shaped how sailors coped with it. Perhaps the most significant cultural difference, however, was the expectation of initiative. American sailors were not only expected to follow orders, but also to think, adapt, and respond to changing situations. This reflected a broader national mindset rooted in industry and innovation, where problem-solving was valued alongside discipline. When American sailors reached port, the contrast became even more visible. With higher pay and access to resources, they approached shore leave with energy and enthusiasm, often spending freely and embracing the opportunity to escape the routines of shipboard life. This sometimes led to tension with Allied sailors, particularly in places like Australia and Britain, where differences in behaviour and resources became apparent. They were admired for their confidence and capability, but also seen as overwhelming, representing a navy that was not only growing, but beginning to dominate. Yet even this system of efficiency and initiative stood in sharp contrast to another navy, where discipline took on a far more rigid and unforgiving form. The Imperial Japanese Navy. The Imperial Japanese Navy was built on a foundation of hierarchy, obedience, and endurance that went far beyond standard military discipline. Where Western navies allowed space for individuality or initiative, the Japanese system demanded conformity and absolute adherence to authority. Life aboard ship could be harsh, and for many sailors, it was defined by strict control from both officers and senior enlisted men. Physical punishment was not uncommon, and harsh treatment was often accepted as a necessary part of building strength and resilience. The individual was expected to subordinate himself entirely to the group, creating crews that could operate with remarkable cohesion, but often at significant personal cost. At first glance, this structure appeared efficient and controlled, but beneath the surface it could be unforgiving. Morale was not maintained through comfort, ritual, or reward, but through a deeply ingrained sense of duty and obligation that was tied not only to the Navy, but to the nation itself. Unlike the Royal Navy, there was no equivalent to the daily rum ration, no ritual that softened the edges of discipline. Alcohol existed, but it did not define daily life, and moments of relaxation were limited compared to Western navies. In port, Japanese sailors remained disciplined and controlled, rarely displaying the excesses seen among their British or American counterparts. They were less visible, less approachable, and often perceived as distant by other navies. They were respected for their discipline and effectiveness, but also regarded as relentless and, at times, unforgiving, reflecting a system that prioritized unity and endurance above all else. While this rigid structure created formidable crews, another navy would develop a very different culture, shaped not by ideology or tradition, but by the extreme conditions of its environment. The Kriegsmarine. If the Japanese Navy was defined by hierarchy, the German Navy, particularly its submarine force, was defined by environment. Nowhere was this more apparent than inside the U-boat fleet, where the conditions of life beneath the sea shaped a culture unlike any other. The U-boat was not simply a ship. It was a confined, mechanical space where men lived in constant proximity, surrounded by noise, pressure, and the ever-present threat of destruction. Space was limited to the point of discomfort, with many sailors often sharing bunks or sleeping wherever space could be found. Fresh food quickly disappeared, hygiene was low, and the smell of diesel fuel became inescapable. Under these conditions, discipline took on a much different form. Rather than relying on constant enforcement or punishment, submarine crews depended on trust, professionalism, and quiet competence. Every man understood that failure did not result in reprimand, but death of the entire crew. This created a bond that was less about authority and more about mutual understanding. Commanders within the U-boat fleet often fostered this environment, recognizing that cohesion and trust were essential for survival. So orders were followed not out of fear, but out of necessity. Alcohol had little place aboard a U-boat during patrol, where clarity and focus meant survival. Unlike the rituals of the Royal Navy or the structured systems of the United States Navy, life inside a submarine was defined entirely by the demands of the mission. On surface ships, German naval culture was more conventional, structured and professional, but still distinct in its emphasis on efficiency and control. In port, sailors were generally reserved and disciplined, aware that they represented not just a navy, but a state under constant scrutiny. They were regarded by others as efficient and very dangerous, and in the case of submariners, almost invisible. The French Navy. The French Navy entered the war as a capable and professional force, with skilled crews, strong traditions, and a culture shaped not only by discipline and technical expertise, but by a distinct sense of national identity carried into daily life at sea. Before the fracture of 1940, French naval life reflected the values of the society it came from. Food was not treated as a simple necessity, but as something to be prepared, shared, and preserved, even in the confined environment of a warship. Crews often took pride in their cooking, and when in port, ships would make efforts to bring aboard fresh, local ingredients, maintaining a connection to French culinary tradition wherever they operated. Wine was present as part of this culture, typically accompanying meals rather than being issued as a formal ration. It was not ritualized like the British tot, nor restricted in the same way as in the United States Navy, but instead existed quietly within the structure of daily life, reinforcing a sense of normality and identity. Port visits reflected this same character. French sailors were generally seen as more measured and formal, less prone to the excesses associated with other navies, and more inclined towards social interaction that reflected national pride, rather than release from discipline. Their ships, and the men aboard them, were often viewed as representatives of France itself. However, the events of 1940 would fracture that identity in a way few navies experienced. With the fall of France, the Navy became divided between those who remained under Vichy France and those who joined the Free French forces. Where other navies relied on unity to maintain culture, the French Navy during World War II was forced to operate without it. Discipline and professionalism remained, but identity became uncertain. Sailors were no longer defined solely by their role, but by the question of allegiance. The Regia Marina. Where the French Navy was shaped by division, the Italian Navy presented a different kind of contrast, blending strong tradition with a more human and social approach to life at sea. The Regia Marina possessed modern ships and capable crews, yet it often struggled to match the effectiveness of its opponents, not necessarily because of its sailors, but due to broader issues of coordination and leadership. Life aboard Italian ships tended to be less rigid than the German Navy, allowing for a more relaxed atmosphere that placed importance on maintaining elements of normal life even during wartime. Food played a central role in this culture. Even under difficult conditions, Italian sailors valued meals as a way to preserve morale and identity. Wine was commonly consumed, not as a formal ritual, but as an expected part of daily life, reflecting broader cultural traditions. Camaraderie was strong, with crews forming close social bonds that helped sustain them through the challenges of war. In port, Italian sailors were often seen as friendly and engaging, though sometimes perceived as less disciplined by other navies. Despite these perceptions, Italian forces demonstrated moments of effectiveness, particularly in smaller units and specialized operations, where skill and determination could overcome broader limitations. The war at sea was never simply a contest of ships or weapons. It was a meeting of cultures. Each navy fought with steel and fire, but also with ideas, habits, and ways of thinking that had been shaped long before the war begun. And when those ships met on the open sea, when guns fired and torpedoes struck, it was not only machinery that collided. It was entire worlds and cultures. From the gun decks to the bridge, every story we tell honors those who served. If this tale made you feel the salt and steel of history, give it a like, and if you're not yet part of our channel's convoy, subscribe and join the ranks. More powerful stories await.